Welcome to week 4. Just a quick recap. In week 1, we looked at the Bible and saw it as a revelation of God in history. In week 2, we looked at Exodus, wilderness, and covenant. Then last week, we looked at the conquest of Canaan and Joshua and the period of the Judges. This week, I want to just sum up on the time of the conquest and look at other books that are set in that time, Ruth and the first few chapters of the first book of Samuel, and then reflect about what we have learned about God, ourselves, and of our dealings with other people. And then finally, we move on to the new topic, which is the desire for a king. The period of the conquest, as we saw, was a time of struggle and hardship, of transition, change, and adaptation. It was a period of religious and moral degeneracy, marked by a recurring pattern of turning away from God and turning back to God in times of desperation. The final stories in the book of Judges are illuminating. There is a story of the gang rape of a Levite's concubine, in a story that is very reminiscent of the story of Sodom. And it results in her death. That leads to intertribal warfare among the people of Israel. And then there is the story of the abduction of the daughters of Shiloh. And the book of Judges ends with the words, "In those days, Israel had no king, and all the people did what it seemed right in their own eyes." I often think that's a fairly good description of much of what happens in our world today. Everyone doing what seemed right in their own eyes. The story of Ruth is set in the turbulent time of the Judges, but in contrast to the book of Judges, it has an almost idyllic quality. It is the story of an Israelite woman whose husband and children have all died while they were living in a foreign country because of the exile, living in a foreign country because of famine. And when she decides to return to Israel after her husband and children have died, her 2 daughters-in-law decide they will accompany her. One turns back along the way, but Ruth, a Moabite woman, insists on following Naomi. "My God will be your God, your God will be my God, and where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people," she says to Naomi. And she comes back, and they live in hardship and struggle. But Ruth remains faithful and is blessed by God. Blessed to find a husband who loves her, and through that husband, she becomes an ancestor of King David. It is a story of tenacity, tenderness, and faithfulness in a time of unfaithfulness. It's an interesting book because it challenges the nationalistic exclusiveness of much of later Judaism. So, what does the period of the conquest have to say to us about what we have learned about God, about ourselves, and about our dealings with other people? Well, again, throughout that period, God remains constant in love. When Israel turns away to worship Baals, God punishes them by removing his blessing. and his protection. But when they cry out to him in their distress, again and again he accepts them back and gives them a judge who liberates them from their oppressor. Israel's pattern of harem, of God's divine wrath, reminds us of how often we attribute to God and co-opt God in terms of our own desires, our own prejudices. We use God to legitimate our prejudices and our attitudes and our behaviors. We have only in the modern world to think about racism, of slavery, of gender bias and violence, of homophobia, all of which are still today modern day equivalents. Living in a time of rapid change and accommodation to different circumstances always bring with them new challenges. But the book of Ruth reminds us that we do not have to accommodate ourselves to the prevailing patterns of the times, especially when the patterns and behaviors compromise the heart of our faith and our behaviors. And Ruth models for us a way of living in relationship that is loving, gentle, and understanding. A way that is willing to suffer hardship to maintain relationship with others in absolute integrity. And so we come to the birth of the monarchy. Under the judges, Israel sought to dominate her Canaanite neighbors. But as I ended the last talk by saying, they were unequal to the escalating task in their conflict with the Philistines. A Bronze Age people, as I said, are not equal to the task of resisting an Iron Age people, especially one that had Cretan military training and a monopoly on iron. The Philistine ascendancy led to a series of Israelite setbacks in battle, culminating in a battle in which the Ark of the Lord, the ancient symbol of God's protecting and guiding presence of his people, which they carried in battle to protect them against the Philistines. The Ark itself was captured and carried off into captivity. And at that point, the Philistines are well on their way to making the whole of the Fertile Crescent a Philistine empire. And it's something of a mystery why they failed to consolidate that military supremacy. But three things happen immediately after the capture of the ark. Firstly, a plague of tumors fall upon the Philistines, and after 7 months, they return the ark to Israel. The people of Israel at that point cried out to God in the true pattern of the judges, and Samuel ordered them to get rid of all their idols and to turn back to God. And he leads them in a service of restoration, probably a covenant renewal, during which time the Philistines draw near to attack and were routed and did not return throughout the days of Samuel. But when Samuel was old and nearing the end of his life, the people came to Samuel and they said this, "Look, you are old. Your sons do not follow in your footsteps. Now appoint for us a king to rule over us like the other nations." At one level, it's entirely a reasonable request in the light of the Philistine threat. And what follows in the book of Samuel shows evidence of differing strands of tradition, all faithfully recorded and kept together in the final editing. If you read 1 Samuel chapter 8, you'll find 3 clear and distinct strands of opinion. There is a pro-monarchy wave that cannot wait to have a king. There is a neutral group that are largely indifferent one way or the other. And then at the other extreme, there are the old guard, the confederationists under Samuel, who strongly and are implacably opposed to a king. Samuel recognizes the huge implications, and he warns them. Having spoken with God, he says to them, God is saying, it is not you, Samuel, that the people are abandoning, it is me. They want to be a king. They want a king to be like other nations. And now I'm putting words in Samuel's mouth and God's mouth. But that is exactly what they were not called to be. They were called to be a light to the other nations, not to become like the other nations. And so warn them of what will happen. They will be enslaved by their own kings. They will be reduced to vassals. They will be conscripted into military service, into labor. There will be corruption, nepotism, taxation. We know it all. But the people refuse to hear. We want a king, they say. We want to be like other nations. And so Israel gets a king, someone chosen by Lot, seeking God's blessing. And the person who is chosen is Saul, the handsomest of all the men in Israel, and one who stood head and shoulders above all the others. Interestingly, Saul was also a humble man, and he hides away in an attempt to avoid being made king. And he is received with acclamation. But the book of Samuel tells us that some worthless fellows said, how can this man save us? Good question. Because truth is, no human can save us. But the book of Samuel tells us, and they despised him and brought him no present. And Saul held his peace. In other words, in the very election, the recipe for disaster and failure is there. Saul was potentially a good man, but failure was inevitable because he was rejected by the old guard, including Samuel. Even though Saul never assumed any great kingly privilege and lived simply like one of the judges. Because of that, he was unable to raise a dependable army, and because he was little more than a judge, was unable to command the allegiance of all the tribes. And so in turn, he was unable to crush the Philistines. He was condemned at one point by Samuel for violating the cherem, and seems to have been literally driven to insanity by Saul's insistence that God had abandoned him. And finally, he was doomed to failure because emerging in his midst was a young man, David, a much more charismatic leader, who emerges very early in Saul's reign and simply adds to the alienation of Saul from the people. For David becomes their hero. Saul has slain in the thousands, they say, but David has slain in the tens of thousands. Having said all that, Saul was a brave man who managed to hold his tribe's loyalty throughout the period of constant war with the Philistines. And we come to the end of Saul's life, where he and his son are slain in battle by the Philistines, and David is shortly afterwards acclaimed as king in the southern parts of the kingdom, and ultimately in the northern parts as well. But that's another story.